Hi, students. This week we will be discussing one of the most famous passages of philosophy in all of history, the Allegory of the Cave in Plato's Republic. So this reading is from what we call classical Greece. It's 5th century and 4th century BCE, so about 2,500 years ago is what ancient classical Greece is. And this was a period when philosophy was starting to be defined. Socrates is one of the first philosophers in ancient Greece. There were philosophers who came before him, but he kind of formed the method of philosophy that is most widely recognized today. And it's important that we think about Socrates and how he practiced philosophy for this class. So what he would do is he would go around just wandering through the streets of Athens in the marketplace and ask people lots of questions. We'll read more about this method next week when we talk about the Apology. But essentially, Socrates really just had a lot of conversations. For him, philosophy was asking questions and trying to figure things out in dialogue with others. His follower, Plato, was following him around and would write these conversations down. So if Plato didn't write these sort of dialogues, we wouldn't have any record of what Socrates said or any of these philosophical conversations he was having. So the story you're reading from today is actually from a much longer dialogue. It's a very long dialogue. It's a big, thick book if you ever want to read the entire thing. And they're really talking a lot about politics, education, knowledge, and ethics in the Republic. It's a discussion of what an ideal utopia society would look like and what education should look like in a just and good society. I gave you this image in your reading guide so you can kind of picture what's going on in the Allegory of the Cave. Socrates says he's going to give us an allegory for education and what the deprivation of education means. So when we aren't learning, when we are in a state of ignorance, it is like being chained to a cave wall where we can't move around, we can't see ourselves, we can't really see anything except what's just right in front of our face. And in this allegory, he says that the cave is kind of lit by fire and there's people walking by with objects on sticks that cast these sort of shadows onto the wall. And you hear the echo, right? So people who are chained to this cave and their heads are forced looking in front of them, all they see are shadows and all they hear are echoes. And that is reality for them. They know nothing else. Socrates then says, let's imagine if someone was released from their bonds and forced to look at the fire. In that case, they would be very confused, their eyes would hurt, they'd be dazzled. They really wouldn't be able to understand what they're seeing. So even though the fire is more real and they can finally see the reality of their situation, it actually looks like it's a false reality. It looks like a dream or an illusion or a hallucination or something. And the shadows on the wall feel like that's real instead. And so to turn away from the shadows on the wall is a difficult process. And that's something that Socrates emphasizes, right? It would be hard to escape from this cave. It would be hard to get out. You would have to keep going up this sort of road outside of the cave, and you would be exposed to brighter and brighter light. And at each stage, your eyes would hurt and you'd have trouble seeing and you'd have to adjust to it. And you'd have to be brave and curious to continue forward because every step that came before that would be more comfortable and more familiar to you. So he's giving us this sort of allegory for what it's like to try to learn. And it's not comfortable and it's not easy and it requires a lot. Then he also gives us description of what it's like when you get outside of the cave. And if you have never seen sunlight before, if you've been in a cave your entire life, your eyes would burn and it would be so difficult to see anything outside in the world outside the cave. And so he says at first, people would really only be able to look around at night, right, in the moonlight instead of the sunlight. They can't handle the sunlight yet. And then he says gradually they'd be able to look at reflections in water, but they can't really look up, right? They have to see things that are kind of still a little shadowy, a little blurred. And then gradually their eyes would strengthen. And he says that the last thing that they are able to look at would be the sun. And that's important not just because it's the brightest and it shows that their eyes are now strong enough to look at that light, but it also is the sort of ultimate pinnacle of knowledge within this allegory. He says they would look at the sun and be able to study it and realize that that's the source of all light, right? It's the source of all knowledge, and it's the source of all light, right? It is why the world around you with trees and plants and all these things exist. And so for him, this journey outside, you arrive at a particular point. And when you arrive at that point, that's when you really understand everything and see everything there is to see. So this is an allegory. He says very clearly what it's an allegory for. And I want to just think about a little bit why we use allegories in philosophy. Nietzsche's going to use allegories. Sartre is going to use allegories. We use a lot of metaphors in philosophy because a lot of times we're talking about abstract things or things that are really big ideas. And we have an easier time dealing with a story that gives us imagery and helps us think about what it feels like and what that experience is like when we have this sort of imagery of a story. So we use allegories to talk about ideas. And so what philosophers are really interested in is the ideas. What are the concepts that are there? What is the argument that is there? They're not so much interested in the story. They tell the story so we can get at the idea. And here Socrates says that sight is this analogy for learning. So sight and how strong your eyes are, how much you can see, is sort of a measure of how great your understanding is. And light in the allegory is sort of truth. He says that truth needs to be shed on things in order for us to see them. And then the ultimate thing that we can learn, the highest form of knowledge in this allegory, is the sun. And for Socrates, that is the good, or the form of the good, which I'll get to in a little bit. I'll explain what the forms are in a minute. But he says the main point of the story is that if we think about what education isn't taking this empty head and putting a lot of information in it, right? That's not what learning is for Socrates. He says that idea is almost like thinking you can put sight into blind eyes. And he says, instead, what education assumes is that everyone has the power to see. Everyone has the power to learn. It's already there within them. And what learning is what teaching and learning is about turning that person, because they're not pointed in the right direction. So if they're facing the cave wall, they can't use their power of sight. They have to be turned towards light, and they have to be put in environments where they can learn. And so he says education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and tries to redirect it appropriately. So that's what learning is for Socrates. The other thing that the other idea that this story illustrates is Plato's divided line. And this is on page 1130 in your reading. And I told you to kind of skim over it because I didn't expect you to understand it on your own, but I want to explain it in depth because it's really important for understanding Plato. So the divided line is kind of like a ladder you climb to reach at an understanding of something. And the cave is like that, right? There's steps, there's levels. You kind of see things a little bit shadowy and in the dark in the cave, and you get towards greater and greater light until you reach the very top of this ladder, and you can kind of understand everything there is. So what Socrates is trying to do is point out the difference between a low level of understanding, like mere opinions or just speculation, and actually grasping what something is, fully understanding it. And this points out that learning really is this kind of long process. It's not just something you do very suddenly. And this divided line is divided into two it's divided into four segments, right? Imagination, belief, thought, and understanding. And he says that imagination and belief belong to what he calls the visible realm. So the visible realm has to do with how things appear to our senses, right? How things look, how things kind of feel. And if we can think about people inside the cave, right, they're hearing echoes and they're seeing shadows, right? So they're seeing just the appearances and they don't understand the reality. Then the intelligible realm moves you beyond your senses when you start reasoning about things and figuring things out. And so it's what we know with our minds rather than what we know with our senses. And everything we read with Plato is going to be about not taking appearances for what they are and questioning them, because appearances can be very deceptive. So Socrates and Plato are very much committed to trying to get beyond appearances, trying not to let appearances fool us, and getting to the sort of truth or reality of things through ideas and using our minds. So imagination, when you hear the word imagination, you usually think of imagining something that's not here in front of you. And that's unfortunately not what this word means in ancient Greek. So the ancient Greek word has more to do with images or imagery that you see in front of you, especially like with your eyes. So imagination simply means the way we think when we're relying upon appearances and kind of taking things at face value, right? So it's a sort of unreflective, uncritical, unthinking way of taking in the world and seeing the world. So there's lots of examples of why this is a bad way to approach the world. I can't just use appearances, right? So here's an example. It's a pencil that is in a glass of water, and due to light refracting, it looks like it's broken, right? So if I didn't know anything about how light works and how vision works and how light travels differently through water than through the air, I would be like, oh, what's going on with this pencil? It looks broken, right? So I have to have knowledge and understanding in order to determine why this appearance is wrong. But if I don't have that, if I just look at the appearance of it, I'm going to be very bewildered by the fact that this pencil looks broken, but when I take it out of the water, it looks fine. And there's lots of examples like this, right? So if I look at the sun outside in the sky, it doesn't look too far away and it doesn't look very big. I don't know, maybe it's like 50 feet away and a few feet big in circumference. But if I know geometry and astronomy and all sorts of stuff, I actually know, no, that sun is enormous. It's much bigger than the earth and it's very far away from me. And it's a good thing because it would burn me up if I was close, right? So we have to move beyond how things look to get an idea of them. And you can probably think of tons of examples. So children really go off of appearances and they're very impressionable. This is why we have to be careful what children look at and view and see, because they don't yet understand things. They don't really have the context or the information about what they're viewing. So for example, when I was little, I had a lot of false ideas about the world. I thought people put butter on hot food to cool it down. I didn't understand it was for adding flavor. I love asking my friends the story, like, what did you think when you were young? That turned out to be just completely wrong based on appearances. And one of my friends thought iron, like people iron their clothes to heat them up, to make them nice and toasty warm before you wear them. So she didn't realize irons are for getting creases out of things, right? So when you're little, you kind of just rely on appearances and you have to mature out of that. You have to figure out, oh, things are not the way they appear. I have to learn how to think about them. So the next step on that rung after imagination is belief. And belief is still in the visible realm, which means you're still working with appearances. And that means you're not really going to see the true reality of things quite yet. You're not yet at that level of ideas. But you can form some opinions, right? So it's a little stronger than just your first impression of something, but it's a type of opinion that you can't confirm yet. There's not evidence or reasoning for it. So I think flat earthers are kind of a good example of belief. They make all sorts of arguments where they're like, I'm standing this distance away from two cities and look at these two cities. These two cities look like they're on a straight line. The earth is flat. There's no curvature, right? They make lots of arguments like that based on appearances. But I mean, this is a conspiracy theory. I'm pretty sure the earth is spherical. I'd have to ignore tons of science. Even the ancient Greeks, like even Plato and Socrates, believed the earth is round because they use shadows and they actually measure the curvature of the earth in ancient Greece as well. So yeah, this is an example of an opinion that isn't knowledge. So flat earthers, they're kind of on the low rung of this ladder. The next rung of the ladder moves us into the intelligible realm, right? So we're moving beyond appearances and it's thought. right? So we're not yet at understanding. Socrates says that thought is the intermediate between opinion and understanding, right? So you have some sort of belief and you're trying to work through it to confirm that it's true so you can reach the understanding of it. So it's more than opinion because you're reasoning about it. You're trying to gather the evidence. You're trying to pin down that opinion and show that it's the case, but you're not yet at a complete understanding. And this process can take a really, really long time, right? We can spend our entire lives thinking about something and not fully understand it. And in fact, if you become a specialized expert in a field, that's what you'll feel like. You'll feel like you're just constantly thinking about things and never really feeling like you reach the complete understanding of it. And then finally, the top of the ladder is called understanding. That's what education aims at. That's what learning is aiming at, is understanding something. And Socrates says, he has this very special language he uses. He says, when you understand something, it means you grasp the form of that thing. So when we use the word form, that might sound weird to you, like the form of something. It is the idea, the definition, the essence of what something is. And definition is kind of misleading because definition has to do with usage, but really the way to think about form is it's what it is that makes something what it is. It's not going to be subject to changing appearance. It's not going to be particular. It's going to be a concept. And let me explain to you why the form is never particular. It's never specific. It's never like an individual thing. It's always merely conceptual and abstract. So I want you to imagine a dog. I want you to picture it in your head and think about exactly what that dog looks like and have that in your mind. Okay. Now, depending on what kind of dog you imagined, right? You might have been imagining your own dog. Maybe you have a dog and you might answer, oh, it's really small. It's light colored. It has big pointy ears on top of its head because you have a Chihuahua. Or maybe you had a Great Dane and you're like, oh, it's an enormous dog. It's taller than me on its hind legs. It has floppy ears and a sad face and it's spotted, right? So if we were to use your image of dog to describe what it is that makes a dog, that wouldn't be helpful because it could be like you could describe long hair or like a shaggy dog, a small dog, a big dog. There's so many different types of dogs. So if we say, okay, well, what is it that makes a dog? What is the form of dog? Well, then you have to get at something that's conceptual. So what makes a dog is that they belong to a particular family, the Canis lupus familiaris. And I'm not going to go into the scientific explanation of what a dog is, but you'll notice that this is a concept, this is an idea. And so all the little individual particular dogs have to fit into this larger category. And so by the time you get to the larger category, what it is that makes a dog, it's no longer something you just see, or it's no longer something that's just based on individual appearances or experiences you've had in your life. You have to gather together many things and figure out what they all hold in common. And what they all hold in common is going to be conceptual. It's not going to be something that you know through your senses. And for Plato, it's not just that the form is what it is that makes something what it is, but it's the ideal or best version of something. And that's because, take for example, a chair. Like if I'm thinking about what makes a chair, I'm not thinking about a crappy chair that falls apart when I sit in it. I'm not like, oh, a chair is something where you sit in it and it falls apart. You're thinking, okay, well, what is the purpose of a chair? Purpose of a chair is to sit in it. So it's going to be supportive. It's going to bear my weight. It's going to make it easy for me to be in a seated position. So you'll think about what a good chair is when you're thinking about what it is that makes a chair. And Plato thinks this is true of everything. So if we bring this back to the allegory of the cave, inside the cave is this sort of lower rung of the divided line, this ladder you use to climb to an understanding. And it's about appearances. It's about the visible realm. And it's always changing. It's dim. It's ambiguous. It's really a place where we have these opinions, and opinions tend to shift around because we don't know if they're true. So if we don't know if they're true, if we don't have evidence for them, then they are really subject to outside influence and we change our minds about it a lot. But when you're outside of the cave, you're in this different space. You're not going off of appearances. You're not just forming mere opinions. You are forming uh, sort of ideas of what things are. And when you reach the form, that's not going to change. That's going to be an unchanging reality. It's going to be like if you have the essence of friend, that's going to be the same in all your cases of friendship. It's not going to be changing every time you create a new friend. And for Socrates, that means you understand what things really are. You are no longer living in a cave, you're out in the real world. So, if we put it all together, what this allegory is telling us is that you can't trust your first impression of something. Appearances are deceptive. You have to really examine your assumptions and opinions. You have to be willing to say, I'm wrong, because sometimes we are wrong and we need to move forward with a different perspective and a different way of seeing. You have to be able to think for yourself, right? You can't force sight into blind eyes. We all have the ability to see for ourselves. And so we need to practice that. We need to be able to question things. We need to be able to grow our own ability to see. And then the other thing we get from this cave is that learning is a difficult process. We don't just waltz outside of the cave and it's not super pleasurable to be blinded by bright light. Um, but what we do get is greater freedom. I think if we look at this allegory, even if the people in the cave are really comfortable with their chains and they're not being challenged, I don't know that most people want to live in chains, or maybe people do. Maybe people want to live in chains. But there's something about learning that brings greater freedom. It makes our horizons bigger. It expands our minds. It helps us to see the world as it is, which is complex and large and big instead of small.